Thank you so much for welcoming me and for having this meeting here today. It's just great to see all of you, and I hope I get a chance to get to know you some. I'm going to start with, in kind of maybe an unusual way, and that is telling you about my Christmas holiday. I have a daughter who teaches English in Austria, and I got to go overseas and visit her for the holidays in the winter. And when her colleagues who also teach in an American school in Austria learned that I was coming, one of them, Lydia, who lives in southern Italy, said, "Your mom cannot come without coming to my parents' house in southern Italy for Christmas." So we flew down all the way to Bari, and this is, just like a magical tale to me. Who would ever imagine you get to do this, right? We flew all the way down to southern Italy, down to Bari, and were welcomed by this large family where we got to have Christmas Eve, Christmas, and the day after Christmas, with 20-something, fluctuated somewhere between 20 and 30 at different moments in time. Grandmas, grandpas, aunties, uncles, cousins, and the first grandchild, little Ariana. And when they said her name, that's what they did every single time, Ariana. And even Ariana said her name, Ariana. Is 15 months. And just a charmer. And the first thing we heard about how the holiday would go was, Ariana will be here. So clearly the family totally organized around her. And it was just a delight. We came into their home and they were preparing, of course, for all of the holiday meals. And so we would wake up in the morning about 10 a.m. because they don't do real morning like we do. And they'd give us coffee and biscotti, and we'd get in the car, and they would take us out touring so we could see while all of the cooking was going on. And when we would get back, the living room would have been reorganized and be one huge table, but the table would be squished against the wall just in case Ariana wanted to dance. And Ariana is 15 months old, so she dances like this. 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot. And every time she started dancing, someone would shout, Ariana wants to dance! And everyone would run from the kitchen and all the cooking would stop and everyone would mirror Ariana's dance. And so you can imagine 20-something adults all dancing. Every once in a while, Ariana's leg would go up too high and she would fall back, land on her bum, and her grandpa would dive to the floor and lift her up and rock her. So I'm going to talk about adverse childhood experiences this morning, but I want to hold in all of our hearts that notion that's way beyond resilience, right? It goes to that magical cherishing of human beings, that celebration moment by moment, and all of our strong instincts. Ariana's grandpa didn't know that rocking soothes the amygdala and helps you calm. He didn't need to. It's just a part of how their family works. But for many families, that memory is missing from their vocabulary. And so some children grow up with a very different kind of life than Ariana has. All of us, when we're first conceived, start with a pretty neutral start. And all of us are adapting to our experiences. Our brains, our bodies, our immune systems, all of us are adapting. Our brain is preparing for the world we'll be living in. And some children live in a dangerous world, a world with either episodic danger that can't be predicted, so they're always looking around for the next problem to come, or with constant danger where their cortisol levels or other stress hormones and neurotransmitter levels are elevated in their bloodstream and their brain and affect the development of the brain. And we know that people who grow up with lots of toxic stress, we call it toxic stress because cortisol, one of the stress hormones, is actually toxic to developing neurons, the cells in the brain. And so cortisol will change the functioning and can actually kill the cells. So when we say that we're adapting in pretty dramatic ways with changes to brain function, brain volume, and the regulation of our bodies. So people who grow up with this toxic stress develop fairly predictable characteristics. They could be more hypervigilant, quick to anger, quick to act also, slow to soothe. They can be more focused and very mission directed and have a difficult time picking up all of the ancillary details around them. They can have a hard time picking up social cues and understanding what they're seeing in the environment. Some people can have a difficult time even navigating the physical space around them. And these characteristics, actually, I was taught when I was in college that this whole track was maladaptive, but that's not true. Scientists have broad agreement now that we are adapting to our environment, that all of this is adaptation, not maladaptation. Because these characteristics are actually very valuable and help the species to stay alive if we have to live in a dangerous world our whole lives. And some people grow up in a really safe world, and those people also develop pretty typical characteristics. They can be more relationship-oriented, more oriented toward process. They're the people who will talk things through even when it would be a good idea to jump up and run. Actually, I thought this bottom track was adaptive, except when my daughter got to about age 14, and I kind of wanted her to get up and run. So it has its downside as well. And the trick we were taught by Dr. Martin Teicher, who is the neurobiologist we worked with for many, many years. Marty Teicher is in charge of neurobiology and biopsychiatry research at Harvard Medical School and McLean Hospital. He teaches doctors all over the world, amazing rock star scientist. We're so lucky to learn from him. And he taught us that it's not really so much which track you grow up on that creates the big challenge. It's the dissonance between how your biology has adapted to your childhood and what society expects of you. And so if, in fact, you are expected to sit calmly, to talk things through, to never have an emotional spike, to always be able to pick up on all the cues around you and have all the opportunities that you're noticing, but your body adapted to the top track, and so instead you do have emotional spikes, and you're quick to act and slow to soothe, society can be very critical of you. In fact, how do we treat people who grow up on the top track? How do our big systems, our education, our juvenile justice, our school systems, how do they treat people who are hypervigilant, quick to act, slow to soothe, have difficulty talking things through? We diagnose them with ADHD. Often there are other diagnoses. Sometimes I hear shouted out. What else? Yeah. We isolate. We suspend. We expel. We isolate. Right? We discipline. We criticize. All except this marginal, tiny few who become our heroes. So we're kind of strange as a society about this. Some people become the firemen, the sports heroes, the military heroes, right? These are actually characteristics that can be useful if, in fact, what you need to do is stay a little bit distant from what's actually going on in order to act and jump in decisively and to take care of saving your life and the lives around you. The last thing I want to say from the neuroscience is that we actually have different experience of reality moment by moment. And we don't talk about this very much, but neuroscientists teach us that there's actually essentially a switching mechanism that engages the brainstem and limbic system, our fight-flight mechanism, that actually filters the information that our bodies are taking in through our five senses. So that information comes in through our five senses, and our limbic system and our brainstem, in a fraction of a millisecond, makes a decision for us that the information will be filtered all the way in to be processed in our frontal lobe so we can make decisions about it. Or the information comes all the way in and filtered out in favor of survival. And of course, this isn't a one kind of thing versus nothing. It's a very complex array. So we're actually experiencing sensory experience that's different from one another in this very moment. And when I learned this, I realized that one of the simple accommodations we can make to make more space and more welcoming for everyone in our society is to simply ask, how did you experience the last 20 minutes? We don't open up the safe space for people to tell the truth of their life experience very often, but when we do, we will be surprised, as I've been very surprised, to hear the differences in how we experience and to hear where the answers are for how to make this world a more welcoming place for everyone. So I've been talking about neuroscience, which really is the study of individuals. And now I'm going to switch gears and talk about the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which is a study about population health. It's a public health study. So it's not about individuals, it's about all of us, the population as a whole. So as we walk through this, if you know about my adverse childhood experiences, you don't necessarily know anything about my health or mental health, right? You can't make a decision based on my ACEs about me as a person. But if all 100 of us had very many adverse childhood experience categories, we could make some predictions about the risk for all of us as a whole. So it's a population study, not a study about individuals. And when this study was first created, it was developed by two amazing scientists. One was Dr. Vincent Folletti, who was at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego at the time, in charge of preventive medicine. And the other was Dr. Robert Anda, who was at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. And Dr. Anda had been studying heart disease and had been on the team in our nation that had developed the nation's preventive strategy for stopping death from heart disease. He had won international awards and national awards for that work. And that work really was about the top 3 rungs on this pyramid. It was about identifying risk for heart disease so we could reduce disease and early death. And actually, the prevention science at that time was entirely about that. And so one thing that's remarkable about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience, ACE or ACE study, is that they were testing a completely new hypothesis. And the reason they were testing it was that Dr. Anda had spent years working on heart disease prevention, but it bothered him that risk was not random in the population. Something had to be driving the risk. So he was always listening and looking for what was driving that risk. And he theorized when he met Dr. Folletti and heard some of Dr. Folletti's experience from the Kaiser Permanente clinics, he and Dr. Folletti theorized that perhaps adverse childhood experiences were driving social, emotional, and cognitive impairment was the word they used then. We would use the word adaptation. In fact, I just noticed in Rob Anda's slides, he changed that word now. Adoption of risk factors, et cetera. That ACEs are actually driving the kinds of adaptations in our bodies that lead to disease, disability, and social problems. This is the largest public health study of its kind, over 17,000 participants who not only answered a full health assessment plus all about their childhood adversities, but also gave access to their medical records through the rest of their lives. So it's a retrospective and prospective study. We're learning from that cohort of people every year. There are over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles. So if you get into this science and you start talking to people and people question the credibility, let me send you the vitas of these gentlemen. You will be absolutely stunned at how impressive their scientific record is. These were the 10 adverse childhood experience categories that Dr. Anda and Dr. Folletti decided to study. There are 5 indicators of family dysfunction, 3 types of abuse, and 2 kinds of neglect. So they asked adults whether in their childhoods, before their 18th birthday, they had a mentally ill, depressed, or suicidal person in their home, if they had a drug-addicted or alcoholic family member, if they had parental discord as indicated by separation, divorce, abandonment, if they witnessed violence against their mother, if they had incarceration of any family member. These are indicators of the kinds of things that would create stress in children's lives. They asked about 3 kinds of abuse and 2 kinds of neglect. Now, these scientists never thought this would be the entire list of adversities in childhood. They knew, well, that there are many kinds of things that can create toxic stress. Interestingly, though, the neuroscience that I just shared with you wasn't yet published and the findings weren't yet made. And so they were theorizing based on what they'd observed in epidemiology. So before I talk more about the ACE study, I want to just back up and give you a sense of the magnitude of the findings here in this study. Imagine yourself in the 1840s and 50s living in the British Isles. In fact, imagine yourself living in London, and every few years a wave of cholera would sweep across the British Isles and kill tens of thousands of people in each sweep. Families would wake up in the morning and everyone would be alive and well, and by nightfall, half of the people would be gone. It was a devastating, devastating time. And at that time, everyone felt they knew the answer to this problem. They knew the cause of these deaths was miasma, the smell in the air. So you can remember all those old-fashioned pictures where they had big incense sort of containers hanging from the street lamp holders. Well, that was to get rid of the smell in the air because everyone was sure that it was the smell that was killing people. That's a mental model. So when we have a mental model, a belief about the truth, our brains actually filter out all the other information, and we only let in the information that matches our belief because we know that's the truth, right? All of us do that because that's the way brains work. But if we develop a learning community together and we develop the habit of questioning and saying, is there another way to think about this? Then we'll be like Dr. John Snow. Dr. John Snow said to himself, and probably his close friends, it just doesn't make sense. I can't line up the facts. Because people aren't dying of lung symptoms. People are dying of intestinal symptoms. It can't be the smell. It has to be something else. And so when the next wave of cholera came into London, he began to do something we call shoe leather epidemiology. He just put a little X on a map every time there was a death. And unfortunately, it didn't take very long to make a very clear picture. The picture was all the X's lined up around one water pump, the Broad Street pump. So imagine you're in your home, Dr. Snow is your friend, he runs to your house and he says, I've got it, look at this map. It's the water. What do? Stop drinking the water. Anything else? I mean, that's really an important thing to do. I think you would do two things. I think you'd stop drinking the water, and I think you would tell people, stop drinking this water. And in any major public health discovery, for the first decades or even 100 years, those are the actions that save lives. We tell everybody, and we take action in our own domain. It would be over 100 years before we had clean water law, right? So I'm urging you today to think about who you'll tell and what action you'll take as you learn more about this science in your own sphere of influence, because that is, in fact, how we will save lives in the next few decades. The ACE study is as large a public health study as the discovery that water could carry disease. And I'll show you why. So when the scientists looked at those 10 categories, they found that ACEs rarely come alone. If you have one category of adverse childhood experience, it's very likely that you'll have more than one. In fact, 87% of the people who had one category of ACE had more than one. So it didn't make sense for them to study one category of ACE at a time, which, by the way, was how all the literature prior to the ACE study was structured. It made more sense to look at how the accumulation of multiple categories added up. And so the scientists made a simple way of looking at accumulation. They made an ACE score. Each category of adverse childhood experience counts for 1 point. And so the score in the original study was 0 to 10. When we learned about this study in Washington, we began to do education about it because it is such a powerful finding. And we did education all across the state. And that led to us actually putting an ACE module, a set of ACE questions, into our behavioral risk factor surveillance system survey, which is a telephone survey of adults. And when you do that, the module from the CDC doesn't include the neglect questions because the neglect questions didn't make it all the way through their very rigorous testing through focus groups, et cetera. So in the Washington data, which I'm going to show you, the ACE scores are 0 to 8. So the first finding we had in Washington was the biggest finding from the ACE study as well, and that's that ACEs are common. ACEs cross all socioeconomic lines, they cross all ethnicity and racial lines. ACEs are us. Nearly 2/3 of the adult population has at least one ACE. 26, almost 27% of the adult population have 3 or more categories of ACE, and about 5% have 6 or more. The next finding is really interesting, and it has to do with a test they use in epidemiology, the gold standard of inferring cause, which was developed by Sir Bradford Hill. And it has actually 9 tests, but this is the one of those 9, and the ACE study meets all 9. But this is the one test that creates these visual graphs that I'm going to show you. It's the dose-response pattern. And in the dose response, you all know it, right? You put more gas in your car, you can drive more miles. Or in this case, it would be more like the less gas you have in the car, the less miles you can drive. We're talking about along the bottom, the dose of adverse childhood experience. So in the charts will show you there are ACE scores along the bottom. And the vertical axis is how much risk for a particular condition is in the population. So what we can see from Washington data and the original ACE study data is that ACEs are driving a significant part of risk for disease. So let me talk you through this first chart about smoking in Washington. This was actually in 2009. And once I've done that, you'll be able to read all the charts because they all read the same way. And really, you don't have to read the detail. If you just look at the pattern, that stair-stepped pattern from lower to higher is a classic dose-response pattern. So along the bottom, you see groups of people. The group with 0 ACEs, 1, 2, 3, the group with 4 or 5, and the group with 6, 7, or 8. And you can see that among the people with 0 ACEs, about 10% were smoking. Among the people with 1, 13%, 2, 11%. Among the people with 3 ACEs, 16% were smoking. And it goes on up to 28.5% of people with high ACE scores were smoking in 2009. This is after our state invested millions and millions and millions. And did I say millions and millions and millions of dollars helping people quit smoking and preventing people from starting? So why would people still be smoking in 2009? And why would we see this pattern where the higher the ACE score, the more likely people were to be smoking? Got any guesses? Yeah? Because they weren't treating the problem. Or maybe they were with nicotine. Yeah, because remember some of the typical characteristics include being edgy, which we could actually translate also into anxiety, being quick to anger is slow to soothe, having difficulty with a multiple focus that you need in order to succeed in school and work, et cetera. Nicotine's actually pretty effective at helping with those problems. So for some people, nicotine doesn't feel like a problem, so they're not relating to all of our ads about what a big problem it is. It feels like a solution. It's actually solving problems in their lives. It just is a very dangerous solution. So that gives us a hint about what we need to look for. People's behaviors have a reason. And so when we see people behaving in ways that create risk, we need to look deeper into what are the origins of that risk? What are the reasons? And can we help them cope and accommodate in ways that are much less dangerous? So you see the same dose-response relationship between having ACEs and having a drug problem, which goes from 1% to 12% as ACE scores rise. And we could have charts for all of these: drinking and driving, being addicted to drugs, ever injected drugs, and it goes on and on. We can also see from the ACE study and from the Washington data that a large portion of chronic disease is driven by adverse childhood experience. 25% of cancer, 24% of cardiovascular disease, large percentages of chronic disease in our population have their origins in adverse childhood experience. And you can see these dose response. where there's almost a doubling of risk for cardiovascular disease from 0 ACEs to the 6, 7, or 8 category, and for asthma from 1% to 12% as ACE scores go up. Asthma is interesting because we have a brilliant researcher in our state, Dr. Christopher Blodgett, who's working with elementary school kids, and he's seeing that asthma is one of the first chronic health problems that we see earliest in life associated with adversity in childhood. And a large portion of mental illness is attributable to adverse childhood experience. And if we had more time, I could talk you through the ages and stages in which brain regions are affected, and you would see why we have such a large portion of mental illness attributable to ACEs. We can see the effect of ACEs on anxiety, going from just under 2% to 15% of the population having anxiety disorder, and from 7% at 0 ACEs to 24% for people needing treatment for a mental illness. Again, we see the same dose-response relationship for all of these mental health challenges. One of the very highest relationships, correlations between ACEs and health conditions is the relationship to suicide attempts. And this data is from the original ACE study. We don't ask this question in the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. The blue bars are suicide attempts during childhood, and the red bars are suicide attempts during adulthood. And you can see the dose-response relationship in both childhood and adulthood, with 23% of adults with 7 or more ACEs having made a suicide attempt while they were adults. So if you have pockets in your community where you see suicide, or you hear from your youth surveys that you have youth seriously considering suicide, it doesn't mean that all of that is driven by ACEs, but a significant portion of that problem in our society is driven by the adverse childhood experience history of the population. So in Washington, we wondered, we could see ACEs are common, ACEs are interrelated, ACEs are driving mental, physical, behavioral health, and other problems throughout the lifespan. So we wondered, what about our teenagers? We knew that about 26.5% of our adults had 3 or more ACEs. So we did an interpolation, a statistical bridge between our youth survey and our adult survey to learn about our 10th graders. This is an average 10th grade classroom in Washington. We have no reason to believe it would be very different from your 10th grade classrooms. In fact, the other states that have done the adult survey have found very similar patterns to Washington and the original study. And what we found really alarmed us, because in a typical high school classroom, 42% of our 10th graders have 3 or more ACEs. 26.5% of our adults have 3 or more ACEs, 42% of our 10th graders. Now, we'd already worked with a statistical modeling expert, a corporate expert in looking at complex systems, and we knew that ACE scores will escalate generation to generation unless we're intentionally interrupting them. But we didn't understand that there could be this big a jump. We hear our teachers in Washington saying, classrooms are really different now. It's because they are different now. We hear kids saying, you just don't get our lives. It's because we probably don't get their lives. Because they're carrying an ACE burden that is very significant. And with that burden for them as a population as a whole, they are also carrying risk for disease, disability, and lifelong challenge. So this is a generation that will become the next parents. This is a generation that we'll need to support in very different ways in order to help them have the power to prevent ACEs for their children. When we are talking to business leaders, sometimes to foundation leaders, we talk some also about ACEs and work-life experience. And ACEs are actually driving challenges in our productivity. In fact, we had one Boeing executive say after he saw this data, this is the thing that will stop us from being globally competitive in the next century. Yes, it is. Because ACEs are affecting work-related injury and illness. They're affecting the things that cause productivity to drop, like relationship problems, hopelessness, drug, alcohol, health limits, etc. Look at this dose response to missing work. So about 4% of the people with 0 ACEs missed 10 work days in the last month, half. And 20% of people with high ACE scores missed 10 work days in the last month. I don't know about you, but the last time I missed 10 work days in a month was when I was in Italy with my daughter. I don't think I've ever missed 10 work days because of illness. I'm so lucky, right? Because 20% of people with these high ACE scores are regularly not being able to do their usual lives. So in Washington, let me just sum it up. Dr. Chris Blodgett's work, amazing work. He's developed a way to learn and approximate ACE scores among elementary kids without asking the kids or families. His method is published in a peer-reviewed journal, and you can find it online. He's using the knowledge that adults in the school already have about the kids. So undoubtedly it's underreported, but a nice method to consider. He estimates that 12% of our elementary kids have 3 or more ACEs. By high school, it jumps to 42% having 3 or more ACEs. Our court-involved youth, of course, have higher ACE scores, and that shouldn't surprise us, really, given the predictable characteristics that you would develop. But here's the fact that really caused a shift in our dialogue in our communities, that 85% of our kids in juvenile courts who had high ACE scores began to be suspended from school in 2nd grade. So if you're not safe at home and you're not welcome at school, we shouldn't be surprised that you're knocking at the court's door. We also have learned, because we've added other questions to our behavioral risk factor surveillance system, that ACEs are driving adult adversity, incarceration, worker injury, et cetera, et cetera. But you might recognize that top 5. Those are the 5 adult conditions that become ACEs for the next generation. Remember the 5 household dysfunction. And so we actually can start looking at intergenerational transmission of ACEs because we're measuring these 5 things. You can't ask on a telephone survey, have you hit your children in the last year, right? I mean, you're not going to get a good answer to that question. But you can ask about these things. And we've done all the cognitive testing. We're getting solid results there. And what we can see is that parenting adults with 5 or more ACEs, parenting adults with high ACEs, are 14 times more likely to be passing multiple ACEs on to their children. That's even when they're successful preventing child abuse and neglect. So this is one of the ways that ACEs go up generation to generation, is that our normal response to toxic stress might include difficulty with relationships, risk for substance abuse, etc. So we were curious, if you have ACEs in childhood, plus you have these adult adversities, do the challenges get even bigger? And here's how we learned about that. We looked at this question of functionality. We were looking at people who have 15 to 30 days out of their last month where they couldn't do their usual activities because of some disabling condition. And we looked, all the people that are represented in this chart have 3 or more ACEs. And in this first bar, these are people with 3 or more ACEs plus 0 of these adults' adversities, right? And about 4% are missing half to all of their month, where they can't do their usual activities. People with 3 or more ACEs plus 1, about 5.5%. 3 or more ACEs plus 2 jumps to 18% of those people are missing half to all of their month, where they can't do their usual activities. And look at this. When we turn our backs and we let ACEs get up over 3, plus those are the very same people we allow to pile on 3 or more adult adversities, we see that those people, about 57% of them, lose half to all of their month where they can't do their usual activities. So if you work in a service system and you hear people saying, why don't they show up? Remember this slide. They might not be able to show up in any part of their lives very easily. And we have simple changes that are happening in our systems now. One very simple one is, instead of saying you missed your appointment, people can say, we missed you. How do we set this up so that you can actually be a participant and be both someone who receives help and someone who gives help? Because no one likes to be on the receiving end all the time. So here's the strategic direction. Parents are the people with the most power to prevent ACEs in the next generation. There's nobody else that has more power than parents. Parents are where it's at. So we can have all the systems in the world, but if we're not successful in helping parents in their lives in ways where they can prevent ACEs from piling up to 3, 4, 6, 7, 10, then we will have failed that next generation. Parenting can feel a lot harder, and this is why. I'll give you guys, this is too much information, but I want to give you an electronic version and a PDF so you can use this as a reference, because people can have interruptions to their health, their cognition, their behavior, their relationships, and crisis. And the odds of them having challenges in all of these arenas are pretty high for the population of people with high ACE scores. So their lives can be more difficult. And so when you hear parents say, I just thought, I often talk to parents as audiences, and many times they'll say, thank you so much. I thought it was me. I thought I was nothing. And they'll say, no, it was really what happened to me. It was really what happened in my life. And it's okay for me to ask for some help because my life is a little harder. And it is. So here's the strategy I am promoting. We need to moderate the effects of ACEs among parents with high ACE scores, particularly in ways where they can prevent ACEs in the next generation. If we're successful in doing that, we set up this virtuous reinforcing cycle where we're going to get the kind of sustainability that we've only dreamed of in the past. Because lower ACE scores leads to lower ACE effects, leads to lower ACE scores, leads to lower ACE effects. And that is a reinforcing cycle that's hard to stop. Unfortunately, we're going the other way right now, so we're going to have to intentionally reverse the cycle. And I'm hopeful because we're seeing that in Washington. So how will we do that? Resilience literature says we have to build 3 systems, social systems, in order to be effective. We need to build the capabilities of individuals. We need to enhance attachment and belonging. And we need to improve the sphere of life that is larger than self, right? Our community, culture, spirituality, that sphere of life. And you'll see many communities that have historic trauma recovering their historic and cultural ways of life as a strategy for prevention. And it's a good one. So what helps people with the core capability that's most difficult probably in that self-regulation? It's interesting because the scientists are telling us that mindfulness, reflection, movement, massage, exercise, play, some of the things that our American workaholic life have sort of taken out of the way we typically live our daily lives are actually very, very effective at soothing the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that sends out the messages that we should have a panic, that there's danger coming. And soothing the amygdala is really helpful for helping people to self-regulate. Oops. And one of our high school principals decided he would use this knowledge to change his discipline structure. So he learned that many people with lots of adversity in childhood, in the middle of an emotional spike, they can't also have a rational conversation about the situation, right? Because there's a thing called lateralization in the brain so that you can't actually get to your rational self while you're in an emotional spike. You probably know people who have that challenge in their lives because it's actually pretty common. So the principal decided he would put targets up all over the school, and he taught his adults that anytime there was an altercation where a kid would normally need to be disciplined, the first step was for the adult to walk over to the target and reflect on his or her own emotions. So where am I on the target? I'm in the red because you just swore at me. So I'm not going to be able to talk about your discipline for a little while because I'm in the red. Your turn. And then the youth has a turn to reflect on his or her emotions. And actually reflecting on your emotions lights up a different part of the brain and helps you self-regulate. But the most important thing about this change is that it meant that the conversations about accountability happened when both the adult and the youth could actually process the conversation. So in every case there were consequences, but the decisions about the consequences happened at a time where both people could talk about it. 85% of discipline referrals went down in the first year. So what generates belonging? This is a list, you can glance through it, but I want to make the point that rhythm and ritual make a difference for human beings. One of the ways we help people belong is we have regularity and rhythm in the ways we engage. That's why we have holiday rituals. That's why we have celebrations. But in our society, we've started to schedule more randomly. And so we have these community events, and they're this time, but the next time parents can get together, oh, we don't know, might be another time. And when you think about it, well, Dr. Perry, who's a very famous neuroscientist who's working on practice changes based on this science, says that the reason rhythm is so important is in the womb, we're next to the heartbeat. So at every cell in our body, that beat is soothing and a part of us that we can never separate from. So I want to urge us to think about the rhythm and ritual and regularity with which we engage parents in whatever it is we're doing with them. I want to show you the power of social emotional support. In our behavior risk factor surveillance system, we ask, how often do you get your social emotional needs met? And they answer rarely or never, sometimes, or always or usually. The blue bars always or usually. And these are stress-related diseases, the first one being cardiovascular, the middle diabetes, and the right treatment for mental illness. And you can see that people who always or usually have their social emotional support needs have less stress-related disease, cardiovascular, diabetes, and treatment for mental illness. And we know that that's, the treatment for mental illness is also aligned with mental illness symptoms because we also added the Kessler scale, which is a symptom scale, to our BERFIS, and we could check against it. So actually creating social emotional support is something we can all do. In our work, in our daily lives, we can think more in terms of group, networks of relationships. How do we offer opportunity in that way? And finally, what builds community? So we found 4 variables that are very, very important. One is leadership expansion. What I mean is everyone who wants to help is a leader. So making space for more people across the economic lines, across cultural lines, et cetera, to give and help is a really powerful act. Coming together and talking about issues that actually matter to people and not having agendas that are full of administrative gobbledygook, but really actually calling the question that's in the room is actually a very powerful act, especially if you take care to develop a room that has a lot of emotional safety, physical safety, moral safety. Learning together is actually really powerful in building community. When we learn together, we shift our sense of self. We become a we, and that's very powerful. And learning together also naturally leads to reciprocity. Because if I'm learning with you and I know that, oh, you're in a class and you need that book, I have it. I could give it to you. I already read it, right? Because we're in a learning mode, we learn about each other too and what will help our lives. And last, making decisions from the future we actually want to live in. And Liz is going to talk more about that dynamic in terms of collective impact. So these 4 create a virtuous reinforcing cycle. When you get into this cycle, communities just won't quit. It's impressive to see. They just keep calling themselves together to talk about issues that matter and learning together and making decisions about their future. And that's really what we want, right? So I want to show you a little bit in closing about the power of community capacity. The blue bars are places that scored very high on those 4 factors. And the gold bars are communities that either aren't getting together regularly to build capacity or scored very low over time. And you can see that we have much lower rates of serious mental illness, much lower rates of severe depression, and much lower rates of depression. And higher community capacity scores are correlated with higher percentage of people getting a post-high school education. You can see the bars go up as the capacity scores go up. With a larger percentage of people employed, the bars going up as the capacity scores go up. We made an index out of 3 of the resilience questions that we added to the BRFIS: a hope, positive view of one's life, and social emotional support. And we can see that having those things in your life actually helps with housing stability. The adults that reported high rates of support, positive view, and hope were much less likely to be moving 4 times or more in the last year. And especially for young children, that really matters because each move probably comes with a different caregiver, a different set of relationships, and then what's prompting 4 or more moves a year. There could be stress involved in whatever's prompting it. I wanted to show you something about employment. Now this data came from 2009, right after we'd had huge layoffs. The recession had hit in Washington, and we can see from this chart who was laid off. So the blue bars are the set of population with high resilience scores, that same index, hope, positive view, and social emotional support. And along the bottom we see ACE scores, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, and 6 to 8. So we can see that regardless of ACE score, the unemployment rate stayed between 8 and 12% for those with high resilience scores. But look at what happened to the group of people with higher ACEs and low resilience scores. Social isolation and lack of hope for your future matter. They matter for people's daily lives, for their ability to function in their own lives. We can see this pattern clearly, but I was still shocked that 35% of the people with high ACEs were unemployed if they had low resilience scores. So we can see something, some hints about where we can make a difference in really high leverage ways in improving people's lives. In the end, this is what we're all about, right? We want self-healing communities, communities that just won't stop making themselves healthier and healthier and healthier. And we want to learn from the systems thinking field about how we get that virtuous reinforcing loop in place so that ACEs go down, 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 generation by generation. And I believe that the strongest part of a self-healing community has to be the population that's affected by ACEs. ACEs are common, right? So we need to reach to the parents and professionals. We need to reach to all of us that have been affected by ACEs because we have to be part of the solution. We can't see ACEs as other. We have to see ACEs as us. And here's the real prize we see from increasing community capacity. We see lower ACE scores. In the youngest cohort that would have been affected by the 17 years of work we were doing building capacity, you can see the red lines. Those are communities that scored low on capacity. And along the bottom are age cohorts from the oldest to the youngest. So you can see in the first chart that the prevalence of people having 3 or more ACEs ran pretty much the same in the high and low capacity until that youngest cohort, where we see the percentage of youth with 3 or more ACEs drop in our high capacity places. And we see the same thing when we look at very high ACE scores of 6 to 8, running right along next to each other until that youngest cohort where we see a big difference. We think building community capacity in these systematic ways is part of why we see these big improvements. So these are the things I think are important to keep in mind. I think learning is really important and helping communities stay in a learning mode, forming a long-term partnership with the communities where you're working, structuring staff for the long view and the short view. I actually assigned staff to those roles so that people that were always in the frenzy of what all of our partners needed were not also the same people who had to think about where we were going to be in 20 years and what we needed to do to get there. It's hard to do both things at once. Developing an education framework, this is the one we use, neuroscience, ACEs, resilience, and systems thinking, but any framework that helps unite people and inspire them and hold a fundamental respect for every single person. As we learn more about the neuroscience, we understand more about why every person's behavior has a meaning, and that behavior might not be acceptable, but if we understand that it may be a normal response, maybe we can help figure out what are the changes in environment and relational and other kinds of help, including medication and other kinds of help, that will make a difference in that person's life so they can step up and lead. Because all of the adults alive are the adults that will actually solve this problem for the next generation. So this slide represents the reason that I think the ACE study is the largest, has the biggest magnitude of solution of anything in our time. It's because ACEs are driving a large percentage of so many different challenges in our society. So epidemiologists can calculate the amount of a condition that is attributable to or driven by a disease agent. So they can calculate how much of cancer is driven by smoking, for example, right? We've all heard those figures. This is population attributable risk. So this diagram shows you various different health conditions and health risks around the outer side, and the black oil spill in the middle represents the portion of those conditions that are attributable to ACEs. And you can see that more than 50% of marijuana use, anxiety, disability-interrupted days, life satisfaction, mental health condition that disturbs our ability to work, suicide, more than half of those are attributable to ACEs. 40% of depression, 22% of asthma, 36% of tobacco use, and 32% of binge drinking. We could have a lot of these pie-shaped diagrams because the attributable risk runs from 20 to 85%, and 20% is almost unheard of in public health. It's a very large attributable risk. But what's important is, as we weave this science through all of our work and our neighborhood organizing, we have the potential, like putting a sponge in the middle of that oil slick, of reducing all of these conditions concurrently. This is the only strategic leverage point where we have the potential of really seeing all of the rates come down at once. And we're beginning to see that in our communities where we're seeing the ACE scores drop. Lower cancer, lower drugs, lower drinking, lower accidental deaths, et cetera. It's really an amazing opportunity. So in closing, I want to just take you back to my friend Ariana. Because that's really what we want, right? We really want every child to have that life. Every parent, every grandparent to understand what it looks like. And if they have to fake it, then fake it for a generation to get there, right? We would go in the evening for this 6 hours of eating with course after course after course. And there was one evening, I think it was the last night we were there, where we were all sitting around the table. My daughter and I don't speak Italian. And we were all sitting around the table, and all of a sudden, all the adults start shouting at once with their hands going like this. They're shouting, and they're clearly having some debate. And it's a friendly debate, but it's, emotionally rising. We had no clue what they were talking about. But it was very clear that there were many arguments happening at once, and that all of them were tracking all the arguments. It wasn't a problem for them. This was just the way they talk. It turned out they were debating whether piercings were okay. The generations, right? So little Ariana's sitting in her chair, and she's like, dop, 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 dop. And one of her uncles stands up out of his chair, and he says, "Everyone's quiet. Ariana wants to speak." Ariana jumps out of her chair, and she goes, "Dop, dop, 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 Mamma Mia." I'm not suggesting we all become Italian, but we're making culture every moment. All of our interactions. If we think we are not the ones that can create culture change, we're fooling ourselves, because we are the ones who will do it. And now we have the science to tell us where to focus our effort, what information to weave through, so we're creating the culture change for the world we actually want to live in. Thank you.